I still remember the weight of that cream-colored envelope in my hands, the elegant script spelling out my name in midnight blue ink. My grandmother's 85th birthday celebration, a milestone that would bring together relatives I hadn't seen in years. But as I read the guest list tucked inside, one name made my blood run cold. Marcus. Marcus. The cousin who never left. You see, every family has that one relative who overstays their welcome. But Marcus? He's been living in our family shadow for 15 years now, moving from house to house like a phantom, always there at every gathering, every holiday, every funeral. He's 34 years old and has never held a job longer than 3 months, never had his own place, never built a life outside the suffocating embrace of our family tree. My mother calls him troubled. My father whispers lazy under his breath. But I've always known there was something darker lurking beneath Marcus's perpetual smile and his endless stories about his big break that's always just around the corner. The party was set for the old family estate in Vermont, the sprawling Victorian house where our grandmother had raised 6 children and where Marcus had been camping out in the guest room for the past 2 years. As I drove up the winding gravel path, autumn leaves crunching under my tires, I could see him through the bay window, that familiar silhouette hunched over his laptop, probably crafting another elaborate fantasy about his non-existent business ventures. Sarah? His voice boomed across the foyer as I stepped inside, arms spread wide for an embrace I desperately wanted to avoid. God, you look incredible. Still working at that fancy marketing firm in Boston. The thing about Marcus is that he remembers everything. Every job, every relationship, every small detail you've ever shared with him. It would be endearing if it weren't so unsettling. The way his eyes linger just a second too long. The way he files away information like he's building a dossier on each of us. As relatives trickled in throughout the evening, I watched Marcus work the room like a seasoned politician. He knew exactly what to say to Uncle Robert about his diabetes medication, asked Aunt Linda about her grandson's soccer tournament with startling specificity, and somehow remembered that Cousin Janet had been thinking about changing careers 6 months ago. But it was during dinner, as we all gathered around the massive oak table that had witnessed decades of family celebrations, that I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Marcus wasn't just participating in conversations, he was orchestrating them. A subtle comment here, a well-timed question there, steering discussions with the precision of a master manipulator. Remember when we were kids and used to play hide-and-seek in the basement? He said suddenly, his fork pausing midair as he looked directly at me. You were always so good at finding the darkest corners to disappear into, Sarah. The table fell silent for just a moment, the kind of uncomfortable pause that follows when someone says something that doesn't quite fit. I forced a laugh, but something cold settled in my stomach. We had never played hide-and-seek together as children. Marcus was 5 years older than me, and when I was young enough for such games, he was already the moody teenager who spent most family gatherings locked in his room. After dinner, as I helped clear the dishes, I overheard a conversation between my mother and Aunt Patricia in the kitchen. They were talking in hushed tones, the way adults do when they're discussing family secrets they assume the younger generation doesn't need to know. Has to stop enabling him, Aunt Patricia was saying. 15 years, Linda. 15 years of this nonsense. But where would he go? My mother replied, her voice heavy with that particular brand of guilt that mothers specialize in. He's family. We can't just abandon him. Family doesn't hold other family hostage, Patricia shot back. And that's exactly what he's doing. Look around. Half the cousins stopped coming to gatherings years ago because they can't stand being around him. And the way he talks about that incident with Tommy. My mother's sharp intake of breath cut her sister off mid-sentence. We agreed never to speak of that again. Maybe that was a mistake. I dropped the plate I was holding. It shattered against the kitchen tiles with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire house, but it was nothing compared to the sound of my world tilting off its axis. What incident with Tommy? My cousin Tommy, who died in a car accident when I was 12. As I knelt to pick up the pieces, my hands trembling slightly, I became aware of a presence behind me. Marcus stood in the doorway, his shadow falling across the broken ceramic at my feet. "Careful there, Sarah," he said softly, his voice carrying an undertone I'd never noticed before. "Some things, once broken, can never be put back together again." And as he walked away, I could have sworn I heard him humming under his breath, a tune that sounded hauntingly familiar, like a lullaby from a childhood nightmare I'd tried so hard to forget. Sleep didn't come easily that night in my childhood bedroom, with its faded wallpaper and the twin bed that felt too small for my adult frame. Every creak of the old house seemed amplified, and I found myself straining to listen for Marcus's movements in the guest room down the hall. But the house remained eerily quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. I woke before dawn with a gnawing certainty that I needed answers. The conversation I'd overheard between my mother and aunt had planted a seed of doubt that was growing into something much darker. What incident with Tommy? And why did the mere mention of it make my mother react like she'd seen a ghost? The breakfast table buzzed with typical post-celebration chatter, compliments about grandmother's speech, plans for the day, debates about who would drive whom back to the airport. Marcus sat at the head of the table like some benevolent patriarch, distributing coffee and memories with equal enthusiasm. "Sarah, do you remember that summer when you and Tommy built that treehouse?" he asked, buttering his toast with methodical precision. "You two were inseparable. Such a tragedy what happened to him." I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care. "I remember the treehouse. But I don't remember you being around much that summer, Marcus. Weren't you away at some kind of camp?" For just a fraction of a second, his confident smile flickered. "Camp? No, I was definitely here. In fact, I helped you guys with the roof. Don't you remember? I was the one who taught Tommy how to hammer nails properly." But I did remember that summer, vividly now that I was really thinking about it. Tommy and I had built that treehouse entirely on our own, spending weeks collecting scrap wood and sneaking tools from Grandpa's garage. Marcus had been nowhere to be found. In fact, that was the summer he disappeared for 2 months, and when he came back, he was different somehow. Quieter, more watchful. After breakfast, I cornered my cousin Jessica, Tommy's older sister, as she was packing her car. If anyone would remember the truth about that summer, it would be her. "Jess, do you remember Marcus being around the summer Tommy and I built the treehouse? He's claiming he helped us with it." Jessica's face went pale, and she glanced nervously toward the house. "Sarah, why are you asking about that?" "Because his story doesn't match my memories. And last night I overheard Mom and Aunt Patricia talking about some incident with Tommy. What aren't people telling me?" Jessica was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Marcus wasn't at camp that summer. He was in a psychiatric facility. A voluntary admission, they said, after he had some kind of breakdown. He came back right before school started, and everyone just pretended it never happened." My heart started beating faster. "What kind of breakdown?" "I don't know all the details. I was only 16, and the adults kept everything hush-hush. But I remember overhearing my parents talking about Marcus having episodes where he would claim things had happened that never did. Elaborate stories about conversations, events, whole relationships that existed only in his mind. The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see. And Tommy's accident happened 3 weeks after Marcus came home." Jessica's voice was barely audible now. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you remember exactly how Tommy's accident happened?" I opened my mouth to recite the story I'd been told for 23 years. Tommy had been driving too fast on a rainy night, lost control on a curve, crashed into a tree. But as I really tried to recall the details, I realized something disturbing. I didn't actually remember hearing about the accident when it happened. I didn't remember the phone call, the rush to the hospital, the funeral preparations. Those memories felt borrowed somehow. Like a story someone had told me so many times I'd convinced myself I'd lived it. I'm not sure, I admitted, and saying it out loud made something cold crawl up my spine. Jessica nodded grimly. "Neither am I. And that's what scares me. Because Marcus remembers everything about that night. He's told me the story dozens of times over the years. Always the same details, always with this strange smile on his face. He remembers things about that crash that weren't in the police report. Things that make me wonder. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. We both stood there in the crisp autumn air, watching our breath form small clouds as the terrible implications settled around us like fog. "There's something else," Jessica said finally. "I've been keeping track just out of curiosity. Every family gathering, every holiday, every anniversary, Marcus always brings up Tommy. Always. It's like he's feeding off the memory somehow. And the stories he tells about their friendship? They get more elaborate every year. More detailed. More intimate. I thought about all those family dinners. All those moments when Marcus would suddenly inject some memory of Tommy into the conversation. How the room would go quiet and sad. How we'd all sit with our discomfort until someone changed the subject. I'd always attributed it to grief, to his way of keeping Tommy's memory alive. But now, Jessica, I think we need to find out what really happened that night." She was already shaking her head. "Sarah, some stones are better left unturned. Marcus has been part of this family for 15 years since then. If there was something wrong, don't you think someone would have said something by now?" But as I watched her drive away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been trying to say something all along. The relatives who stopped coming to gatherings. The conversations that died when Marcus entered the room. The way my mother's face went white whenever Tommy's accident was mentioned. And the most disturbing thought of all, if Marcus had been lying about helping with the treehouse, if he'd been lying about being away at camp, what else had he been lying about? And more importantly, what had he been doing that summer that was so bad it required 2 months in a psychiatric facility? As I walked back toward the house, I could see Marcus through the kitchen window, already cleaning up the breakfast dishes with the helpful efficiency that had made him indispensable to the family. He looked up and waved at me, that same bright smile I'd seen 1,000 times. But now, instead of seeing a harmless man-child who'd never grown up, I saw something else entirely. I saw someone who had perfected the art of being useful, of being needed, of making himself so essential to the family's daily functioning that questioning his presence felt like betrayal. And I realized with growing horror that Marcus hadn't been drifting aimlessly through our family for 15 years. He'd been hiding in plain sight. I spent the morning in the town library, scrolling through old newspaper archives on a computer that seemed older than Marcus's residency in our family. The librarian, a woman who looked like she'd been cataloging local secrets since the invention of the Dewey Decimal System, helped me navigate the microfilm records with surprising enthusiasm. "Looking into family history?" she asked, adjusting her thick glasses as she loaded another reel. "The Carpenter family has deep roots in this town. Though there was that unfortunate business with your cousin years back." My hands froze over the keyboard. "What business?" She glanced around the empty library as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Oh, the accident, dear. Such a tragedy. That poor boy, Tommy. Though there were questions, you know. Questions that never got proper answers." "What kind of questions?" But she'd already said too much. She bustled away, muttering about overdue books and late fees, leaving me alone with the glowing screen and a growing sense of dread. I found Tommy's obituary easily enough, a brief, sanitized paragraph that revealed nothing beyond the basic facts. Thomas Michael Carpenter, age 16, died in a single-car accident on Route 108. Survived by parents, sister, loving family. Memorial service details. Nothing about the circumstances, nothing about the investigation. But then I found something else. A small article buried in the local news section from 2 weeks before Tommy's death. Local teen hospitalized after hiking accident. The piece was only 3 sentences long, but it mentioned that Tommy Carpenter had been found unconscious on a hiking trail, suffering from what appeared to be a severe allergic reaction. He'd been treated and released the same day. I'd never heard about any hiking accident. In all the years of family stories and memories shared at gatherings, no one had ever mentioned Tommy being hospitalized for anything before his death. And Marcus, who seemed to remember every detail of Tommy's life, had certainly never brought it up. I printed the article and kept digging. What I found next made my blood run cold. 3 days after the hiking incident, there was a police blotter entry. Domestic disturbance reported at 1247 Maple Street. That was my grandmother's address. The same house where we'd just celebrated her birthday, where Marcus had been living for the past 2 years. The pattern was becoming clearer, and it was more disturbing than I'd imagined. I drove to the police station, hoping that small-town record-keeping might be more accessible than I'd expected. The desk sergeant, a man who looked like he'd been born in uniform, was initially skeptical of my request. "Those files are pretty old, miss. And without being immediate family to the deceased." "I am immediate family. Tommy was my cousin." He studied me for a long moment, then disappeared into the back office. When he returned, he was carrying a thin manila folder that looked like it had been forgotten in a filing cabinet for decades. "Not much here," he said, sliding it across the counter. "Case was closed pretty quick. Clear-cut accident, according to the investigator." But as I read through the sparse police report, nothing felt clear-cut at all. Tommy's car had been found wrapped around an oak tree on a straight stretch of road he'd driven hundreds of times. No skid marks. No evidence of attempting to brake or steer away from the collision. The weather had been clear, the road dry. Tommy had no drugs or alcohol in his system. Most disturbing of all was a handwritten note paper-clipped to the back of the report. Witness reported seeing second vehicle leaving scene, but description too vague for follow-up. Family declined further investigation. A witness. A second vehicle. And the family had declined further investigation. I thought about what Jessica had said, how Marcus had returned from the psychiatric facility just weeks before Tommy's death. How he always remembered details about that night that weren't in the official reports. How he'd inserted himself into Tommy's memories, claiming friendships and experiences that others couldn't verify. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Hope you're having a nice morning exploring town. Marcus made his famous pancakes for everyone. Such a thoughtful boy." Thoughtful. That was always the word used to describe Marcus. He was thoughtful when he remembered everyone's birthdays. Thoughtful when he helped with household chores. Thoughtful when he stayed up late listening to relatives pour out their problems and fears. But what if his thoughtfulness was something else entirely? What if it was reconnaissance? I drove back to the house with my mind racing, the police report burning like evidence in my purse. The afternoon was stretching long, and several relatives had already begun their journeys home. The house felt different now, smaller somehow, more claustrophobic. I found Marcus in the basement, organizing old photo albums with the meticulous care of a museum curator. The basement had always been his domain, the place where he'd set up his various business ventures over the years. A computer repair service that never got any customers, an online store that never sold anything, a consulting firm that never had clients. Sarah. Perfect timing. He looked up from a pile of photographs, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "I'm putting together a memorial album for Tommy. Look at all these great pictures I found." He handed me a photograph I'd never seen before, Tommy and Marcus standing together by the treehouse, both grinning at the camera. Tommy looked younger than I remembered him being that summer, maybe 13 or 14. Marcus looked exactly the same as he did now. "Where did you find this?" I asked, studying the image more closely. "Oh, it was in one of the old albums upstairs. Isn't it great? You can really see how close we were." But something about the photograph bothered me. The lighting was wrong somehow, and the shadows didn't seem to match. More importantly, I was almost certain that particular treehouse hadn't existed when Tommy was 13. We'd built it the summer he was 15, just a year before he died. "Marcus, can I ask you something? Do you remember Tommy having any kind of accident before he died? Maybe falling while hiking, ending up in the hospital?" His hands stilled over the photograph, and for a moment, his expression went completely blank. Then the smile returned, brighter than before. "Hospital? No, I don't think so. Tommy was always so careful about things like that. Very safety conscious." It was a lie. I could see it in the way his eyes shifted slightly to the left, the way his voice took on that too casual tone he used when he was constructing one of his elaborate stories. And if he was lying about something as simple as a hospital visit, what else was he lying about? "I've been thinking," I said, keeping my voice light and conversational, "about that night Tommy died. You've told me the story before, but I'm having trouble remembering the details." Could you tell me again? Marcus set down the photographs and leaned back in his chair, that distant look coming over his face that he always got when he was about to share one of his detailed memories. It was a Tuesday night, he began, his voice taking on the rhythm of a well-rehearsed narrative. October 15th, Tommy had been upset about something. I think it was trouble with a girl at school. He came to see me around 8 o'clock, wanted to talk. We sat right here in the basement for maybe an hour just talking about life, you know? About growing up and making hard decisions. I nodded, encouraging him to continue, but inside I was taking careful notes. October 15th was a Thursday, not a Tuesday. And according to the police report, Tommy's body had been discovered around 9:30 p.m., which would have made Marcus one of the last people to see him alive. When he left, he seemed better, more at peace. I told him to drive carefully. The roads can be tricky at night, especially that curve on Route 108. But you know how teenagers are. They think they're invincible. And you didn't see him again after that? No. That was the last time we spoke. Marcus's eyes were distant now, lost in the memory. I sometimes wonder if I should have tried harder to convince him to stay longer. Maybe if we talked for another hour, another few minutes even, he would have missed whatever moment of inattention caused the accident. It was a beautiful story, full of the kind of details that made it feel real and tragic and meaningful. The kind of story that had probably earned Marcus sympathy and attention at dozens of family gatherings over the years. It was also completely impossible. Because according to the hospital records I'd glimpsed at the library, Tommy had been treated for his mysterious allergic reaction on the afternoon of October 15th. The same day Marcus claimed to have had their final heart-to-heart conversation in the basement, which meant either the hospital records were wrong, or Marcus was lying about when he'd last seen Tommy alive. And given everything else I'd discovered, I was beginning to suspect that Marcus's lies were far more dangerous than simple attention-seeking fantasies. They were the carefully constructed alibis of someone who had been planning Tommy's death for weeks. That evening, as the last of the relatives departed and the house settled into an uncomfortable quiet, I found myself alone with Marcus and my grandmother. The three of us sat in the living room, surrounded by the debris of celebration, empty coffee cups, crumpled wrapping paper, the lingering smell of birthday cake and family secrets. Grandmother dozed in her recliner, her 85-year-old hands folded peacefully in her lap, while Marcus channel-surfed with the restless energy of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. It struck me then how perfectly he'd positioned himself, the dutiful grandson who stayed behind to help clean up, to make sure grandmother was comfortable, to be useful in all the small ways that made him indispensable. "Sarah, you seem quiet tonight," he said, not taking his eyes off the television. "Everything okay?" I studied his profile in the flickering blue light. The same face I'd seen at countless family gatherings, wearing the same expression of mild concern that had fooled us all for so many years. But now I could see the calculation behind it, the careful way he monitored everyone's reactions, filing away information for future use. "Just thinking about family," I said carefully. "How we all have our roles, you know. Our places in the story." He nodded sagely. "I've always thought of myself as the family archivist. The one who remembers things, keeps the stories alive. Someone needs to do that, especially after we lose people like Tommy." There it was again, that casual insertion of Tommy into the conversation, the way he always managed to make himself the keeper of our collective grief. But now I heard something else in his voice, something that made my skin crawl. Pride. He was proud of his role as the family's memory keeper, proud of the way he could shape our understanding of the past with his carefully crafted narratives. "Marcus, can I ask you something that might sound strange?" He turned to look at me directly, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Of course. You can ask me anything. Do you ever feel guilty about surviving when Tommy didn't?" For a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance at being asked a question he hadn't prepared for. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he gave me the kind of sad, thoughtful smile that had earned him 15 years of family sympathy. "Every day," he said softly. "Survivor's guilt is a real thing, Sarah. I've talked to therapists about it. The randomness of life, The way tragedy can strike anyone at any time, it's something I struggle with constantly. More lies, delivered with practiced sincerity. But I'd done my homework. I'd spent the afternoon making phone calls, using my marketing connections to track down information that should have remained buried. Marcus hadn't seen a therapist in over a decade. The voluntary admission Jessica had mentioned had actually been a 72-hour psychiatric hold after he'd been found standing on a highway overpass, talking to invisible companions. Most disturbing of all, I'd managed to track down someone who'd worked at the facility where Marcus had been treated. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, now retired, had been willing to speak off the record about a case that had troubled her for years. He presented with elaborate delusional ideation. She told me over the phone, her voice heavy, with professional caution. Complex fantasy scenarios involving family members, particularly a younger cousin, he claimed to have an intimate relationship with. The concerning part wasn't just the delusions, it was his ability to construct them so convincingly. Even some of the staff began to believe his stories. A younger cousin. Tommy would have been 14 that summer, 5 years younger than Marcus. And now Marcus was sitting across from me, weaving his web of false memories and manufactured grief, using Tommy's death as a shield against suspicion for 15 years. You know, I said, keeping my voice casual, I've been thinking about getting some of those old family photos digitized. Maybe you could help me go through them, make sure we have everything documented properly. His face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. That's a fantastic idea. I've actually been working on something like that myself. I have copies of almost everything, photos, documents, even some of Tommy's old letters. Letters. Tommy had been 16 when he died, not exactly the letter-writing type. But Marcus was already pulling out his phone, scrolling through what looked like an extensive digital archive. Here, he said, angling the screen toward me. This is one of the last things Tommy wrote. I found it in his room after the accident. The image showed a handwritten note on lined notebook paper. Marcus, thanks for being such a good friend. I don't know what I would do without someone who really understands me. I hope we can always be this close.
T.
It was a touching sentiment, exactly the kind of thing that would tug at a family's heartstrings and reinforce Marcus's narrative about his special bond with Tommy. It was also written in handwriting that looked suspiciously similar to the grocery lists Marcus had been making all weekend. That's beautiful, I said, taking a photo of his phone screen. Tommy always did have such nice handwriting. Yeah, he was always very careful about things like that. Very deliberate. But Tommy hadn't been careful about his handwriting. I remembered his homework scattered across our grandmother's kitchen table, the barely legible scrawl that had driven our teachers to distraction. Tommy's handwriting had been notoriously messy, nothing like the careful script in Marcus's letter. I excused myself and went upstairs, ostensibly to use the bathroom but really to make a phone call. I needed to talk to someone who would remember Tommy as he really was, not as Marcus had reconstructed him in his elaborate fantasy. I called my Uncle David, Tommy's father, who'd moved to Arizona after the accident and rarely attended family gatherings anymore. When he answered, his voice sounded older than his years, worn down by grief that had never fully healed. Sarah? Is everything all right? It's pretty late. Uncle David, I need to ask you about something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you remember Tommy and Marcus being close friends? There was a long pause, the kind that comes when someone is deciding how much truth they're willing to share. Why are you asking about this now? Because I think Marcus has been lying about their relationship. And I think those lies might be connected to what really happened that night. Another pause, even longer this time. When Uncle David finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Tommy couldn't stand Marcus. Said he gave him the creeps, always hanging around, always trying to insert himself into Tommy's business. The week before the accident, Tommy came to me and said Marcus had been following him places, showing up at his friends' houses uninvited. He wanted to know if there was some way to make him stop. My heart was racing now. Did you tell anyone about this? The police, the family? I tried to bring it up after the funeral, but everyone was so focused on supporting Marcus through his grief. He was so broken up about losing Tommy, so full of stories about their friendship. After a while, I started to wonder if I'd misunderstood something, if maybe Tommy had been closer to Marcus than he'd let on. Uncle David, what if you didn't misunderstand? What if Marcus's grief was an act? The silence stretched, so long I thought the call might have dropped. When Uncle David finally spoke again, his voice was shaking. Sarah, what are you saying? I looked down the hallway toward the stairs, making sure Marcus couldn't overhear. I'm saying I think Marcus might have had something to do with Tommy's death. And I think he's been using our family's guilt and sympathy to cover his tracks for 15 years. That's a serious accusation. I know. But Uncle David, think about it. Marcus has been living off this family since Tommy died. He's made himself indispensable, the keeper of Tommy's memory, the one who needs taking care of because of his trauma. What if it was never trauma? What if it was guilt? As I said the words out loud, everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. Marcus hadn't been drifting aimlessly through our family for 15 years. He'd been hiding in plain sight, using our love and loyalty against us, feeding off our collective grief like some emotional parasite. And Tommy hadn't died in a tragic accident. Tommy had died because he was the only one who saw through Marcus's facade, the only one who understood what the rest of us were too blinded by family obligation to see. Marcus had killed Tommy to protect his secret. And now, after 15 years of perfect manipulation, I was the only one left who suspected the truth.
I didn't sleep that night.
Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind against the windows felt like a warning. I lay in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of Marcus moving around downstairs, the soft footsteps, the quiet opening and closing of cabinet doors, the low murmur of what sounded like a one-sided conversation. At 3 a.m., I heard him come upstairs. His footsteps paused outside my door for what felt like an eternity before continuing down the hall to his room. But even after his door clicked shut, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. I must have dozed off sometime before dawn, because I woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen. When I came downstairs, Marcus was at the stove, humming that same unsettling tune I'd heard him humming before, the one that sounded like a lullaby from a nightmare. "Morning, sleepyhead," he called cheerfully. "I thought you might want a good breakfast before your drive back to Boston. It's going to be a long day." The way he said it made me pause. There was something in his tone, something that suggested he knew more about my day than he should have. But his expression was innocuous enough, just the same helpful smile he'd worn for 15 years. Grandmother was already at the table, working her way through a plate of eggs with the methodical precision of someone who'd been eating breakfast at the same table for decades. She looked up when I entered, her eyes bright with the kind of clarity that occasionally broke through the fog of her advancing age. "Sarah, dear, you look tired. Did you sleep well?"
Not really, Grandma.
I kept thinking about family stories, trying to remember things from when we were kids. Marcus's humming stopped abruptly. He turned from the stove, spatula still in hand, his attention suddenly focused on our conversation with laser intensity. "Memory is a funny thing," Grandmother said slowly. "Sometimes we remember what we wish had happened instead of what really did. And sometimes we forget the things we most need to remember." There was something in her voice, a weight that suggested deeper meaning. I glanced at Marcus, who had gone very still by the stove, his face carefully neutral. "What do you mean, Grandma?" She set down her fork and looked directly at me, her faded blue eyes suddenly sharp with purpose. "I mean that some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry alone. And some people have been carrying secrets so long, they've forgotten which parts are real." Marcus moved quickly to the table, setting down a plate of bacon with just a little too much force. "Now, Grandma, let's not get confused. Sometimes when we're tired, we say things that don't make sense." But Grandmother ignored him completely, her gaze never leaving my face. "Sarah, do you remember the night Tommy died?" "Really remember it." I thought back to that evening 23 years ago, trying to separate real memory from the stories I'd been told. I remembered being at home with my parents, remembered the phone ringing late, remembered my mother's sharp intake of breath. But after that, everything became fuzzy, dreamlike. I remember the phone call, I said carefully. Mom answered it. No, Grandmother said firmly. I answered it. Your mother wasn't here that night. She was in New York with your father for their anniversary. You were staying with me. The kitchen went completely silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Marcus had gone pale, his helpful smile frozen in place like a mask that no longer fit properly. Grandma, he said softly, you're getting confused again. Sarah was at home with her parents that night. We've talked about this before. But now that she'd started, Grandmother seemed unable to stop. Words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, 23 years of suppressed truth finally finding its way to the surface. You were supposed to be in bed, but you came downstairs for water. You saw Marcus come back that night, saw him change his clothes in the laundry room. You asked him why his shirt was torn, why there was blood on his hands. Do you remember what he told you? The memory hit me like a physical blow, so vivid and sudden it took my breath away. I was 12 years old again, standing at the bottom of the stairs in my nightgown, watching my cousin strip off a torn and bloody shirt. His face had been wild, excited in a way that had frightened me. He said he'd hit a deer. I whispered, the words coming from some deep, buried place in my mind. Said it came out of nowhere, that there was nothing he could do. But there was no damage to his car. Grandmother continued relentlessly. I checked the next morning. Not a scratch on it. And when the police came to tell us about Tommy, Marcus cried so hard they had to give him something to calm down. Cried like his heart was breaking. I could see it now, the whole horrible picture finally coming into focus. Marcus standing in the laundry room at midnight, washing blood off his hands while spinning a story about hitting a deer. The phone call, an hour later. His performance of grief so convincing that no one questioned his presence at the scene, his knowledge of details that weren't in the official report. And somewhere in the chaos of family tragedy, a 12-year-old girl's inconvenient memories had been gently buried, covered over with the adult version of events that made more sense, that didn't implicate anyone in the family. Marcus was backing toward the kitchen door now, his helpful mask finally slipping completely. What I saw underneath was something cold and calculating, something that had been studying us all for 15 years, learning our weaknesses, our guilt patterns, our desperate need to believe in family loyalty above all else. Sarah, he said, his voice taking on a soothing, hypnotic quality I'd heard him use countless times to calm agitated relatives. You're letting Grandma's confusion upset you. You know how she gets sometimes, mixing up dates and events. The stress of the party, all the family together, it's natural for elderly people to have episodes like this. But I was remembering more now, fragments of that night crystallizing in my mind with startling clarity. The way Marcus had seemed almost energized when he came back to the house, the strange smile he'd worn while washing his hands, the careful way he'd coached me on what to tell the adults if they asked about his late return. You made me promise, I said, the memory surfacing like something dark rising from deep water. You said it would be our special secret, that families needed to protect each other. You said if I told anyone about the blood, it would hurt everyone we loved. Marcus's expression shifted again, and for a moment I saw something that made my blood freeze. Not panic or fear, but irritation. Annoyance at having to deal with an inconvenient witness who'd finally remembered her lines. You were a child, Sarah. Children see monsters in shadows, make up stories to explain things they don't understand. That's all this is, childhood fantasies mixing with grief. But Grandmother wasn't finished. She reached across the table and gripped my hand with surprising strength, her fingers trembling but her voice steady and clear. There's something else you need to know. Something I should have told the police 23 years ago, but I was too afraid, too worried about protecting the family. She looked directly at Marcus, her faded eyes blazing with long-suppressed fury. Tommy came to see me that afternoon, before he died. He was terrified, said Marcus had been following him for weeks, leaving notes in his locker, showing up places he wasn't supposed to be. He wanted to call the police, but I told him to wait, said I'd talk to Marcus first, try to handle it within the family. Marcus laughed, but the sound was hollow, desperate. An old woman's paranoid fantasies. Grandma, you're 95 years old. Your mind isn't what it used to be. She's 85, I said quietly. And her mind is perfectly clear. The mask was gone now completely, and what stared back at me was something I'd never seen before, or maybe something I'd been trained not to see. Marcus's face had gone cold and predatory, his eyes bright with the kind of intelligence that calculated angles and exit strategies. "You know what the really beautiful part is?" he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Even now, even with all your clever detective work, you can't prove anything. Tommy's been dead for 23 years. The police file is closed. And who's going to believe the recovered memories of a traumatized 12-year-old and the ramblings of an elderly woman?" He was right, and we both knew it. But as I stared at him across my grandmother's kitchen table, I finally understood the true horror of what he'd done. It wasn't just that he'd killed Tommy. It was that he'd spent the next 15 years feeding off our family's grief, turning our love and loyalty into weapons against us. Every holiday, every birthday, every anniversary, Marcus had been there, the helpful ghost who never left, the walking reminder of our collective trauma. He'd made himself indispensable by being the keeper of our darkest moment, the one who remembered Tommy best because he was the one who destroyed him.
Why? I asked.
Why Tommy? For a moment, something almost like honesty flickered across his features. Because Tommy saw through me, just like you're trying to do now. He knew I didn't belong, knew there was something wrong with me, and he was going to tell everyone. "So you killed him." "I solved a problem," Marcus corrected. "And then I found my place in this family. My purpose. You have no idea how good it felt to finally belong somewhere, to be needed. To watch all of you grieve for someone I'd erased, to comfort you through the tragedy I'd created." The casual way he said it, like he was describing a successful business transaction, made me physically sick. But then I heard something that made my heart stop, the soft sound of my grandmother's chair scraping against the floor. She was standing up, moving toward the kitchen counter with the careful determination of someone who'd made a difficult decision. When she turned back around, she was holding an old rotary phone, the kind that still worked even when the power went out. "I'm calling the police," she said simply. Marcus moved faster than I would have thought possible for someone who'd spent 15 years playing the role of harmless family fixture. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, his hand closing over the phone cord. "I don't think so, Grandma." And in that moment, staring at my cousin's face as his mask finally fell away completely, I realized something that made my blood turn to ice. Marcus wasn't planning to let us leave this house alive. The helpful ghost who'd haunted our family for 15 years was about to claim 2 more victims. And this time, there would be no witnesses left to remember the truth. But what Marcus didn't know, what his 15 years of careful observation had failed to teach him, was that some secrets have a way of surviving even after the people who keep them are gone. Because hidden in the kitchen drawer, among my grandmother's old letters and recipes, was a manila envelope I'd placed there before coming downstairs. An envelope containing copies of everything I'd discovered, the police reports, the hospital records, the testimony from Dr. Rodriguez, and a detailed letter explaining everything I'd learned about Tommy's real death. An envelope addressed to Detective Sarah Martinez of the Vermont State Police, with instructions to open it if anything happened to me or my grandmother. Marcus had spent 15 years perfecting his performance as the grieving cousin who'd never quite gotten over his loss. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd forgotten that some ghosts refuse to stay buried. And Tommy's ghost had finally found someone willing to listen.